Hi, everybody, and welcome to this edition of the Taking Control of Your Diabetes podcast. I am one of your hosts, Dr. Jeremy Pettis. I'm joined, as always, by my good friend and colleague,
Dr. Steve Edelman. Happy to be here, buddy.
Yes. So, as always, if you're just tuning in, Steve and I are both living with type 1 diabetes since we were 15, and we're both endocrinologists. We practice and do research at the University of California, San Diego, and the VA. So this title, or the topic of today's episode, is basically hypoglycemia, or low blood sugars. And to be honest, I'm kind of surprised it's taken us this long to come around to this topic because it's such an important one. And you know, when we talk about why this is an important topic, well, hypoglycemia can be really dangerous. And in its worst situations, it can actually cause death. In its most mild situations, it can just make you irritable and hangry and not fun to be around. So we thought we'd kick it off with telling some stories about our own kind of run-ins with hypoglycemia. And Steve, do you want to start with that?
Sure. You know, we have, I think anybody with type 1, any type 2 on insulin, and some of those on sulfonylureas, we all have our stories. And I think it's the number one thing that most people worry about day to day is hypoglycemia all day long. And
their family members. You know, it's a huge concern. Yeah.
It affects society, affects school, your work, everything. Well, as I said, you know, I've had many lows in my day, but I think the one that I remember the most is right here at the TCOID office in San Diego, where I had a bum knee from a bike accident, and I decided to take the elevator up one floor. I got in there when no one was looking, so because I was kind of embarrassed, I didn't take the steps, and I pushed the button, and make a long story short, the elevator closed and just conked out. The power went out. Then my blood sugar started getting low. And then I didn't have anything in my backpack except a bag of beef jerky. And I was getting lower and lower and sweaty.
So
palpitations.
Yeah, I got to jump in right there.
Please.
Every time you tell this story, I think about, like, you could just not design a more, like, fear-provoking situation than a low blood sugar in a trapped elevator. I mean, honestly, that's everybody's fear with low blood sugars is, yes, it's horrible to get one, but when you're in a situation where you can't get help or treat yourself, you're, in a car stuck on the freeway or whatever it is, but literally an elevator that's not moving, it just must have been terrifying.
Yeah, it did. I kept thinking, is this the way I'm going to go after all these years? And I had 3 empty glucose tab containers from when I used them, I didn't fill them up.
Oh,
and you know me, a lot of times people accuse me of not having anything to take when I get low, but it's something that is a good lesson for everybody. You know, it's Murphy's Law. When you least expect something to happen, it may happen. So thank God I got out, had to call emergency services, and then I ate everything in our snack room. And my blood sugar, I think, went to 475.
Which our snack room for a diabetes organization is just not a healthy snack room at all.
Oh, it's not bad. The peanut butter pretzels,
I just had some beef jerky, which every morning I roll in at like 8 a.m. and just have like a Slim Jim. Like,
if you ever squeeze a Slim Jim at the end where it's cut, all this greasy stuff, like zit stuff in a zit pimple. Anyway, they're small. They're portion control.
Well, we're laughing now, thank God, but that could have gone, horrible. And we actually recreated this whole event where we kind of filmed it and you kind of talked over it. It was done really well. And the title of that session, I think it's called Diabetes Horror Stories in the Video Vault. I don't know, Eric, do you remember what the name of the title was? But we talk about, situations that happen like this, and we'll put it in like the notes of the podcast where people can find it. But,
yes, we will.
It was a great one. So I think, I'll tell my story, but one of the first things about, sticking with yours is that I think it's helpful for people to hear that this can happen to the kind of quote unquote best of us, that you and I are both endocrinologists. We have access to the best technologies, to the best things to treat low blood sugars when you remember to actually put them in your bag. And so if it can happen to us, it can happen to anybody. And that doesn't mean you walk around just fearful all the time, but you have to be prepared. You have to realize that this, unfortunately, is something that happens with diabetes. And if you do have low blood sugars, it's not your fault. You just have to be prepared. So
I'll just say real quickly, Jeremy, you mentioned it, but even though we have continuous glucose monitors, we have low alert levels, we have the emergency low alert levels of 55. This can still happen. And blood sugars that are dropping quickly can surprise people. And we'll talk a little bit later about severe hypoglycemia. But yeah, you have a zillion stories too. I think you should be accused of using the most regular Coke of any diabetic in this country.
I didn't throw accusations at you.
Yeah, you did. You should have had glucose tests with me.
Well, actually, to complete your story, you've got your knee replaced now just a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago now. So you're walking upstairs, and you don't have to ever use that elevator again. So that's, good story there. So the story I usually tell is the one about where when I was on shots, I mixed up my rapid acting and basal insulin. And this is something that can be very easily done. And it's kind of a long story, so I'll make this very short. I was coming off of a pump, and I was going on back to basal insulin. And sometimes when I do that, I'll do kind of a loading dose of my basal insulin, like twice as much as I would normally take to get my basal insulin kind of going. So I actually was trying to take 50 units of basal insulin and accidentally took 50 units of rapid acting insulin. And it took me a long time to realize what I'd done. I ate everything in sight. It was just going low, super low. And finally, thankfully, I had glucagon and was able to kind of raise my blood sugars. So that was a crazy story. But the one I wanted to kind of focus on was one that actually just happened a week or two ago. And I think I showed you my CGM when this happened, or you were following me. And this is just more kind of everyday diabetes stuff. So I had put on a new pump. And sometimes this happens when I feel like I put on a new pump that like the absorption right away doesn't kick in. And I know this happens to me and not to you. We talk about this a lot. And so I was bolusing all day long, and the insulin wasn't getting absorbed for some reason. And it came time to go to bed. And when I went to sleep, it just so happened that my sensor failed. And overnight, like my blood sugar or the insulin just started getting absorbed. So I woke up, in the middle of the night, just really confused. And I kind of skipped that step where you could tell that you were low, where you have like the symptoms. And all of a sudden I just didn't know what was going on. So I actually had to do a finger stick, and I was like 40, and just started. And in the house, I really didn't have much. So kind of like your situation too. It's like Murphy's Law. Didn't have glucagon, but was able to, drink juice and eat tabs. And it was the first time I can think of in a long time where I was like, that could have got me, kind of like you said. And that's scary.
Then it wrecked your whole day. You felt like CRAP.
Totally. Yeah.
And I just mentioned a patient of mine who I kept trying to convince to get glucagon. He says, I've never gotten low. So the next thing I know, a few months later, he's on the freeway. He hears his low a CGM alert go off, and he's feeling normal. He keeps driving, and then he passes out on the freeway, gets into a big crash. Luckily, he didn't hurt himself seriously or anybody else. But I think the point I want to make is there's always a first time. And that's why people can't be complacent if you've never had a serious low before.
Yeah. I've had type 1 for 30 years and nothing's ever happened. Well, it, doesn't matter if it happens, you still need to be prepared. So the point again is not to like these horror stories, but it's just that these things are common. They can happen. And we just need to be prepared about it. So the rest of the podcast, we wanted to just kind of dive into a little bit about what is hypoglycemia? Why do people get it? How do we prevent it, et cetera? So starting with why people with diabetes are prone to hypos. And this really is mostly an issue for anybody with diabetes that takes insulin, type 1 or type 2s, or type 2s that take some of these pills like sulfonylureas. But insulin is really the main culprit. And I think, first of all, maybe we talk about how people without diabetes avoid hypoglycemia. And really what's going on is that you have the beta cells that make insulin, and they can secrete insulin on kind of a second-to-second basis, depending on what the blood sugar is. So the blood sugar goes up from, 85 to 86. It can secrete a little bit of insulin. And then on the flip side, if the blood sugar starts dipping down, it can shut it off immediately. So as soon as the blood sugars start ticking low, insulin gets shut off. Glucagon kicks in to kind of raise the blood sugars. And this is happening again on a second-to-second basis.
Yeah, and I'll just add that this insulin and glucagon, that they both come from the pancreas, it goes right into the systemic circulation where it works almost instantaneously. So you imagine us injecting these hormones into our fatty tissue where it takes a long time for them to have an effect. And I think that leads to a lot of mismatch between the insulin and the amount of carbohydrates that we eat. And just like when you tried to compensate for your blood sugar going up, and then eventually the insulin kicked in.
Right. So, Eric's sitting here next to us enjoying his functional pancreas. And so, yeah, again, if his blood sugar, if he hasn't eaten this morning, whatever, his insulin will kind of shut off. Now, compare that to you and I, Steve, that first of all, we have some basal insulin that's usually, if you take a shot, that doesn't change throughout the day. But most importantly, if you take a bolus of rapid acting insulin, if you take too much, that can be hanging around 4 or 5 hours. It doesn't shut off. So if your blood sugar is going low, there's no kind of ability for the body to kind of turn off the insulin. And when that happens, then the glucagon actually doesn't come up also. So you can see that it's just a setup of you have too much insulin and there's no brake on that. And the other important part about glucagon is that if you take people with diabetes, type 1 and type 2, and make them hypoglycemic, make them their blood sugars low, they just don't secrete glucagon like they normally should. Glucagon just gets all messed up. So you have too much insulin with these slow insulins that we can't shut off. The glucagon that's supposed to kind of be there to protect us isn't there. So no wonder we are predisposed to have these lows.
Yeah, and there's so many other variables that affect our blood sugars throughout the day. It's the timing of the insulin, it's the food you eat, the amount you eat. Then we won't even get into the details of exercise because, the intensity, the duration, the timing, and then there's stress and how you react to that. I mean, there are so many variables that can affect the blood sugar. And you're talking about even in a controlled clinical trial setting, things are tough to manage. So you can imagine that people with diabetes can pull their hair out, basically.
Totally.
Just trying to keep their blood sugars in range.
So other things, that kind of go on just to kind of round this out. So glucagon's messed up, but we can secrete adrenaline. This is epinephrine, norepinephrine. That's something that your body usually secretes when your blood sugars get down in the 50-60 range. And that can help raise your blood sugar. And that's also where a lot of the symptoms come from. The rapid heart rate, the sweating. This is like your body just kind of this flight or flight, response that's kicking in to try to raise your blood sugar. So that's the adrenaline response is still there, but it's a lot of the time is not enough to make, your blood sugars kind of come back from a low blood sugar.
Yeah. In the doctor textbooks and lectures, they talk about these 3 levels. The first level is what you mentioned, the adrenergic, shaky, weak, sweaty, palpitations. And when you first get diagnosed, and for 5 to 10 years, you might get those symptoms at 60 or 70. But as the longer you've had diabetes, you may not feel those. And you get into what we call the neuroglycopenic. And that's when you start getting confused, perioral numbness, and you don't have those initial symptoms to warn you. And then after that, you can pass out and have a seizure.
And I think that's, for us, that's when you can tell you're having a bad low. When all of a sudden your mouth gets numb,
yes,
or you get the little floaters in your eyes. That's when your brain is just not getting enough, glucose in the nerves.
I thought it's when you tell me to take my Adderall. It's either low or ADHD, one of those two.
So the last thing of why we're prone to this. So again, insulin doesn't shut off. Glucagon's messed up. But every kind of I guess a way of saying this is that hypoglycemia begets hypoglycemia. The more hypos you have, your brain kind of resets to what it thinks is normal or abnormal. And if you're kind of repeatedly having lows, that you can kind of lose your ability to fight back. And that puts you at higher risk of having a severe low. So, we'll talk about ways to prevent this, but avoiding hypoglycemia is important so you don't have another kind of bad low, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and if Bill Polonsky was here, he would talk about the hypoglycemia fear syndrome. And I know you and I have both had patients where they've had a bad low, and then psychologically they can never even get near to 200 again. They're typically above that. But I think it's important to say that everybody has their own individual reactions to hypo.
Yeah.
Everyone's different, and that reaction changes over time. And I know they have classes on hypoglycemia awareness training. So there's a lot of things people can do, but I think it's a level of awareness and being knowledgeable about the situations where you could get low.
Yeah, and I think Let's talk about that for a second, because I would say there's two broad classes of patients when it comes to hypoglycemia. One, there's the patient that wants their A1C to be 5.5, and they say they don't mind being low, and they have their blood sugars be 60, 70 all the time. And yes, those patients' A1C is quote unquote good, so their risk of kind of long-term complications is low, but they are at extremely high risk of a bad low. And those patients are probably the patients that make me the most nervous, and they're the ones that maybe they're kind of the hardest to treat, to try to convince them that, hey, look, I know you were told when you were diagnosed that you have to keep your blood sugars in a normal range to avoid eye and kidney disease, but you are so close to a car accident or passing out, a seizure, or one of these events that can kill you. And that psyche is extremely difficult to break.
Terribly to break. And you know what? A lot of these patients, they don't have any complications, but they've had diabetes a long time. And I've learned from you that after 10 years of type 1, you lose any glucagon response to hypoglycemia. Mm-hmm. And Jeremy, you were young and not even born yet, but before the days of CGM, I had several patients like that, and probably one or two a year passed away, found in their apartment. And luckily, and happy to say now that it hasn't happened in quite a while, thanks to modern technology. So it is scary.
Yeah.
And you're right. So what's the other category?
So the other category is the complete opposite. A patient that had a bad low experience at some point, just like you mentioned. Maybe they had a seizure, maybe just something that scared them. And they don't want to have a blood sugar south of 250 ever. They just want their blood sugars, to be high all the time. And you have to work with them gradually to get confidence in their CGM or their pumps or whatever to bring their blood sugars down. So you can see with, hypoglycemia, again, that people have completely different ideas about it. Some people actually almost prefer it, oddly, because they think that that's a better place to be. And some people are so terrified of it that they want their blood sugars to be so high all the time. And then there's everything in between.
Yeah. And luckily, I think most people are in between.
Mm-hmm.
We do have these extremes, but I still remember this one patient of mine. He was a woodworker, and he passed out at a rock concert and was so frickin' embarrassed. Honest to God, Jeremy, he didn't feel comfortable below 250. Mm-hmm. I tried, and he eventually left my practice and at UCSD, and hopefully he's okay. But it really messes with people, and it could cause such a bad experience. I can't blame them for being scared to death.
I had, a patient just like that, actually a nurse, a diabetes nurse, and she knew, everything that needed to be done, but had a seizure, blood sugars 300 all the time. Actually had her work with Bill too, and got her on a hybrid closed loop system, and just started with a really high target. It was actually on the Tandem initially, kept it in exercise mode the whole time. So targeting blood sugars 160 or so, and then just kind of working with her to slowly trust lower blood sugars. And she is doing a lot better. So you can, improve these things. It just takes a lot of time and time.
Yeah. On the other end of the spectrum, I sent Bill a patient who was fearful of highs, just like your first group. And Bill is such a good clinical psychologist. He would go out to breakfast and he would eat a bagel with her, half a bagel, and walk her through the bolusing. Her CGM was right there, so she felt comfortable eating something and bolusing correctly for it. Of course, Bill wanted the free bagel.
Yeah, bagel. I was going to say. that sounds like...
No, it's true, but he actually has done that several times with the same patient, and that patient is doing better. So, I would say for some of you out there that are thinking that you are one of these two groups, seek out help.
Yeah.
Bill Polonsky, I got his cell number. I'll give it at the end of the, and also his partner, Susan Guzman. Mm-hmm. Excellent.
So how common, we talk about that this is common, but Steve and I actually, we published a couple articles where we got our hands on this very large electronic medical record database of 30,000 type 1s in the country, and kind of analyzed all these different things. And one thing we looked at is how common is a severe hypoglycemic event. And what we found is in people with type 1 diabetes, about 5% of patients in a given year, so 1 out of 20 type 1s, will go to the hospital or the emergency room with a hypoglycemic event each year. So those are the most severe, right? The ones that make you have to go to the ER or the hospital. And 5% of type 1s every year, I mean, that's pretty high.
Yeah, and this database that you're talking about was really the run-of-the-mill type 1s with any type of private insurance. And so the database is very good. And I think one of the the two other important things that we should talk about is, I'll let you do it because you did most of the writing, is what percent of patients ended up with an A1C at goal less than 7. This was not that long ago. But the other thing that I'll mention is you showed a graph. Well, we showed a graph. I'm on the paper. Thanks. That when the A1C gets high, your risk for hypo goes up.
Yeah.
And that surprises doctors. And why is that?
Yeah, we used to always think that, hypoglycemia was only a problem when you got your A1C low. That people wanted their A1C 6.5, 6, 5.5. And we actually showed that, yes, those people with very low A1Cs had a high risk of hypoglycemia, but also the patients with A1Cs of 10, 11, et cetera. And we think the reason for that is that if your A1C is 10, 11, you're probably taking insulin sporadically, or maybe don't have the doses quite right. You're fluctuating a lot. And a bad hypo has nothing to do with your A1C, which is your average blood sugar. It has to do with that one event where you take too much insulin. So my take from all of that is there's no A1C that makes you safe from a severe hypo. And I think a lot of clinicians will say, oh, that guy's got an A1C of 10. He doesn't need glucagon. We don't need to talk about hypoglycemia. No, in everybody on insulin, you need to be having this conversation, have glucagon, et cetera. So that was really kind of eye-opening.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of the CGM downloads, where you have time in range, but also, very importantly, time below range. And that gives you the percent of time that people are below 70 and 55. So those metrics are so much more important on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. And then you asked real quick, so it was only about 20% of type 1s that got their A1C below 7. The average A1C in the whole group was about 8.2 or so. And again, these are people that have insurance, they're seeing physicians.
They're not seeing us.
They're not seeing us. Not me, for sure. Maybe you. But so anyways, 5% of type 1s going to the ER, not great. So what are the risk factors? Well, I mentioned hypoglycemia in itself is a risk factor. And if somebody is having a lot of lows, chances are they are more prone to have a bad low. So what is too much hypoglycemia? Well, we have this metric for CGM called time below range, which is the time people spend below a blood sugar of 70. And our official recommendation is to keep that number below 4% of the time, which is actually an hour a day, which to me is actually way too much. If you're having 4% time below range, an hour a day that you're low, I guess officially you're doing well, but I still think that that's too much. I don't know. What do you think?
No, I agree with you.
Yeah.
When you look at your own download, everybody should that wears a CGM. So if you download it for a month, just to explain this clearly, that if it says 4%, that means on average you are below 70, and you could be well below 70. 1 hour a day. Like you could be 3 hours one day and none the next 2 days. But I think 1 hour a day is a lot. Mm-hmm. And some people can ride around 65 and not have any symptoms. So I agree with you. I think it is too much.
Yeah. So hypoglycemia itself is a risk factor. We talked about patients that like to ride low, as we say, that they just kind of hover around hypoglycemia.
Were you like that for a while?
No. Well,
I always thought that because we're sipping Cokes. Not anymore.
Well, this was, I think, before I had a CGM.
Right.
And I did, I think, not like it, but I knew, because I was just doing finger sticks, that if my blood sugars were low, I would get symptoms. And it was just a way of kind of knowing where my blood sugar was. So it wasn't that I was striving for like a perfect A1C. It was just that like maybe it was a time I didn't have to test.
It was like a guardrail for you. You knew that you were not super high.
Super high.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Okay, thanks. I'm off the hook.
Well, no, I was just curious.
So what else is a risk factor? Your age and duration of diabetes. So unfortunately, as people get older and they've had diabetes for longer, you lose some of your fight back to hypoglycemia. So this was particularly an issue like when Medicare wasn't covering CGM. And the diabetes, community was up in arms about how can you take this population that it's at the highest risk and not offer them this technology. And thankfully that's changed. And then we mentioned, A1C is actually not a good, indicator of your risk of hypoglycemia. So don't feel kind of safe no matter what your A1C is. So the next thing is how to prevent hypoglycemia. And then we can talk about how to treat it. So we don't want to belabor it, but get a continuous glucose monitor. And speaking of Medicare, they've now indicated it for anybody that is taking any insulin for essentially any reason. So it used to be you had to take like multiple shots a day for meals. Now it can be if you're just taking one shot, some basal insulin if you have type 2 diabetes. So it's getting to be more available for more people.
And I think our government or even the payers, our insurance companies, realize that for every hypoglycemia visit to the ER that is avoided, they save so much money. I mean, hopefully they're thinking about our lives too. But I think people are realizing how important CGM is. And I think we're excited now they give it to type 2s on basal only. But I think there will be a time when it'll be available to any person with diabetes.
And then you got to set the alarms right. And so I have my my low alert set at 80. But if you're somebody that has had some severe lows before, you might want to set it at 90 or even 100. So you're just aware, a little bit sooner of a pending low. I really don't like when I see patients in clinic and they don't have a low alarm and they just rely on the 55 to wake them up. And by then you're already in a dangerous place. So trust me, I don't like waking up at all for any reason. But I'd rather wake up with my alarm going off at 80 than 55 or not at all.
Yeah, and you can change that at different times. And I want to recommend to people that you go in, a lot of times you can change the sound. So it's not as annoying as the factory set sounds. But the other thing I want to mention that's more important is this thing called lag time. When your blood sugar is dropping, remember that we're measuring glucose in the subcutaneous tissue, that it takes 10 to 15 minutes to catch up to what you really are in your circulation that affects the brain. So if you have, let's say, a diagonal down or one
But I
arrow,
think it's important to say that that's really important when your blood sugars are changing quickly. If your blood sugar's flat, like you really don't have to worry about this lag time. But you were about to say, if you're really plummeting, sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. You can interrupt me anytime you want. Yeah, if you have a diagonal arrow down, I'll continue where I was, or straight down, that means you're changing, 5 to 10 milligrams per deciliter per minute. And even though your CGM may read 60, you might be 45. Depending on how fast it's dropping. So you're right. If you get trend arrow straight across, you're not going to have to worry about lag time. And that's important because the lag time is the opposite direction going up, but that's not as dangerous as on the lag time when you're dropping. And when we were doing finger sticks alone, we had no clue what direction your blood sugar was going.
Yeah. And then the other thing is set up the follow feature if you have a device that does that. And so Steve follows my blood sugar, and we kind of have a code or rule that, you have it set so every time I go below 55, you're notified. And if it's flat or if it's coming back up, you'll leave me alone. But if it's going down, you'll call me, whatever. I don't know, maybe a couple months ago, I got a call from your girlfriend that your blood sugar was low and you weren't responding. And she was out of town. So I got in my car and was on my way to your house. And then you just called me and said, oh, sorry. I was like, I don't know, in the other room.
I was low, man. Don't bug me. I was getting some juice. You know what? You're right. And I think that other time I was riding my bike in Coronado Island.
Yeah.
You called me. I answered the phone, because I saw it was you, and then I hit a parked car. No, I didn't. I was low.
Yeah.
And you know me, I'm not as symptomatic as I was when I was first diagnosed.
Right. So the CGM, what we're saying, can notify you. It can notify people around you. So even, if you're sleeping with a partner or somebody else, it can notify them, wake them up. And then the follow feature is it can notify somebody in a different state. So make sure you're getting all the different benefits of hypoglycemia kind of protection out of your CGM.
What do you think about the hypoglycemia trained animals that pick up hypo in their owners?
Yeah, I think, I don't know. I think the CGMs are better, but I think if for some reason somebody can't use a CGM or whatever, then they do seem to be effective. I have heard that people, it's if you treat them more like a pet and not a service animal, they lose their kind of ability to do that. So I'm seeing them less and less. Remember the TCOAD conferences? There used to be at least a couple kind of hypo dogs.
Yeah.
I haven't seen one in a while.
Well, you know what? I agree with you. They're not a replacement, and I think they could be addition to.
Yeah.
I really don't. I think, now that CGMs are more accessible, they work better. If you like animals, you want to bring your animal on the plane and find a good excuse.
Yeah.
Go for it. No,
yeah, apparently they
kidding.
cannot ask you what the condition is. Just as a service animal, and then you're good.
No, if it helps people, go for it.
Yeah. So CGM, of course, and then if you are on insulin, these hybrid closed loop systems have been shown to reduce hypoglycemia. And the way they do that, I think you guys know, is that if your blood sugars are going low, it can shut off the insulin. So if you're on a pump, you're basically on one of these systems. But if you are having recurrent hypoglycemia, you're above that 4% time below range, or you've had a bad hypo, definitely a strong indication to get on one of these systems because they absolutely can help.
Yeah, it's the way of the future
Yeah.
for type 1s and a good subset of type 2s on insulin.
And if you're a type 2, especially if you're having recurrent hypos, talking to a provider about how can we adjust my regimen with the specific goal of avoiding hypoglycemia. I honestly don't think there's really many places to use sulfonylureas anymore in type 2 diabetes. This is like glypiride, glimepiride, these medications. We have so many different options. You can probably come off of those. And maybe if you're not using a GLP-1 or SGLT2, like the point is you can maybe rearrange things to limit insulin or these other drugs that might be causing hypoglycemia.
Yeah, they do have one advantage. They cost pennies a pill.
Yeah.
And so for people with access problems, they're still used quite a bit, and especially around the world. And same with metformin, it's generic. So I agree with you, Jeremy. If you could rearrange someone's schedule to get off of them, it reduces your risk for hypo because not too many other diabetes pills and even all the injectables do not cause hypo. So take away that risk.
Now, the number one thing I see in terms of how to prevent hypos is that hypos usually come after a high blood sugar, that somebody's blood sugar will go high and then they'll take insulin and go low. So a lot of the time, people with diabetes will develop this kind of pattern where they'll say, well, I'm worried about going low with eating, so I'm not going to take my insulin before I eat. And then they'll actually go high, and then they'll take a big slug of like a rage bolus or correction bolus and then go low. And they can get stuck in that pattern. And the way to avoid that is actually taking your insulin and the kind of correct amount, whatever that is, before you eat to avoid that high in the first place. So paradoxically, the way to avoid lows is actually taking insulin, actually more insulin before you eat. And that's hard for people to kind of get their head around sometimes, but it's so important.
Yeah, I would say this. I had a patient yesterday in clinic who said that she doesn't know how much she's going to eat. I said, well, I do what you suggested. Take about half your usual dose early, 20 minutes before, 30 minutes. And of course, it depends on your blood sugar. Your blood sugar is 220. You should take it a lot longer before. And then once you see what you've eaten, you can take the rest. We should mention Afrezza, which I prescribed for this woman, which such a rapid onset, you take it at the time of eating.
Mm-hmm. So, and then we're not going to go into all these different special situations, but we've done whole videos on exercise. That's a whole different topic on how to avoid lows there. Alcohol, another common reason. Just, things to be careful about when you're sleeping. Certain medications that might make, people prone, or like beta blockers, for example, not being able to feel your lows as much. So, but really the prevention comes down to a lot of using the technology and being smart about kind of the timing of your insulin is so important. And so then when we close out on how to treat, well, guess what? Still old-fashioned carbs are like the way to go initially. And we always say that the liquids are a little bit faster and drinking some juice or soda or whatever. For me and you, we like these little apple juices that we keep by our bed because the kind of the worst lows that people tend to get are at night. When you wake up, you're confused. You can easily get out of bed, eat everything in sight, and your blood sugars are 400. And what a pain that is. So you and I just tell each other, well, you can just stay in bed and just drink that juice and just chill out for a second. You'll be okay. And that's times, so hard to do.
It is hard to do. And many times I'll drink one juice, and I think my juices, I got away from the Martinelli's apple juice because they were too many calories per grenade, as we called it, but it's 120 calories, treetop, it's pretty good. And I almost feel like I want to drink the second one. And every time I do, I go too high.
Yeah.
But luckily, Jeremy, I can't tell you how many times I used to go to the fridge and could not stop eating cookies, Trick cereal with milk, leftover milk, put more Tricks in.
And you just tell yourself, you're like, oh, I need it. My blood sugar's low.
Yeah, and then of course.
You're like, I'll level out at 99. But no, you go to 450.
Yeah,
For me, it's always Ritz crackers, sharp cheddar, Tula milk cheese with peanut butter.
Slowest absorption.
In like a rotation. Yeah. So the other thing is, like, I every once in a while go on Amazon and buy like 8 like kind of those bigger cartons of the glucose tabs, and I put them everywhere. I have them container. What would you call that? A little container. Yeah, one in my car, one in my work bag, and not the tubes, the ones that hold like 100.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
the whole jar.
Yeah, so
plastic jar
in my work bag, my car, by my bed, everywhere. And I like glucose tabs because I don't like glucose tabs, meaning I never would just snack on them. I never eat them. I never have any desire to reach in and have a glucose tab, but they're great to have around. And it's easy to do. It's kind of this one time, go on Amazon, spend $40 and get like a crap ton of them.
I know if you had Skittles, which are good for treating lows, your kids would eat them.
Yeah, and I would eat them too. So then having carbs around, we talked about some of our favorite low things, which you should not do, which is peanut butter. And then glucagon. So everybody needs glucagon, and we've talked about this a lot, but there's several new glucagon formulations. There's the Gvoke pen by Xeris, which is kind of like an EpiPen. It's pre-mixed. You don't see the needle. You just push it down on your skin. It's an auto-injector, very easy to use. Stable at room temperature for 2 years. Great option. The other is Baqsimi, which is actually a nasal spray. So the important thing is have some glucagon, know where it is, and show your friends or family where it is and how to use it. And now that with these new formulations, they're very, very easy for non-medical personnel to use. The older models that we had, if you will, you actually had to mix it with a vial and syringe, and it was a huge needle. Actually, it was really painful and hard to do. So these new formulations, ask your provider about it, know where it is. Anything to say about that?
Yeah, I would just say if you have one of these older ones, make sure that it's not expired, and then get a newer one, because a lot of times someone that's going to help you is not medically oriented. They haven't had diabetes. They're unfamiliar with syringes. And the old erector sets, they save people, but they're so difficult to use. And also, if you watch our video that we did for healthcare professionals, it can take time for someone to figure it out, read the instructions. And at that time, you could be losing brain cells. And in one of our upcoming podcasts, we're going to be talking about how low is low.
Yeah.
So keep an eye out for that one as well. The other thing we should mention is what you did with your example. You can give glucagon to yourself. If you feel like you can't keep up with the rate of drop of your blood sugar for any reason, give yourself glucagon, either Baqsimi or the Gvoke HypoPen. I've done that twice myself. And in the future, just like a recent publication, we're going to have mini dose glucagon to treat hypo.
Yeah.
And that'll be awesome.
And we've been talking about this because Gvoke makes their pen, but they also have a vial and syringe of glucagon. So people have started playing around with little mini doses, a unit or two, take before exercise or whatever. So not just for the severe seizure situation, but can we use glucagon as little taps to help with kind of avoiding lows?
Preventing exercise-induced hypo, our good friend Mike Rydell published, who also has type 1 from Toronto, and also treating lows. So you wouldn't even have to worry about eating a jar of peanut butter you normally do.
I know. Eating that on a treadmill is tough. But then the very last thing is, yes, then eventually we're going to be putting glucagon in pumps too. And, there's one company, Islet, that's working on this bihormonal pancreas, insulin and glucagon. And they might even have a glucagon-only mode for people with just constant lows. It's not people with diabetes, but other things. So there's a lot going on in that world. So, kind of stay tuned. But I think in wrapping it up, we've covered a lot of ground. This is common. It happens to you and me. We told some of our war stories. But there are ways you just need to be prepared. Have the technology, making sure that, it's working, have carbs around, have glucagon around. And that's really the best that you can do. And knock on wood, you and I have stayed safe because of a lot of these things. But if something does go wrong, you just got to regroup, kind of reload your glucose tabs. I'm sure you did the next day, and just, continue to be prepared.
Yeah. And just, remember that there's always a first time. And if you have any, if you're driving a lot, you're working around heavy machinery, it's always important to keep an eye on your blood sugar. Hopefully you have a CGM and prevent those lows. And then also tell your coworkers too, so that they can administer glucagon if they need to.
Yeah. Well, with that, I'm going to go have another Slim Jim, I think, and then we can go see you guys or listen to you guys in the next one.
Thanks, Jeremy. That was really a good podcast.
Yeah. All right, buddy. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.